While I was in London just now serving as scholar in residence, I went on a crisp, sunny London day to Primrose Hill. And there I saw a very kind of strange but funny sight of many different dogs and animals dressed in clothes, basically. And obviously, it was a cold day, so people were trying to keep the animals warm. But it got me thinking about this idea of why is it that animals don't have clothes, whereas humans do. Humans, not just do humans have clothes, humans use clothes by a way of, as a means of identity, as a means of expressing who they are, of individualism. And it goes back to the very first moment, the very first act, I would say, human act of creativity, which happens in Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden. What we see is that the humans create a form of a covering after they eat from the tree of knowledge. There's many different reasons for that, which we're not going to get into now. Perhaps that feeling of all of a sudden being exposed that they didn't have beforehand. But it is a very impulsive response, almost an immediate response to the discovery of their own human fallibility and maybe even their own human insufficiency. And it's this shame, perhaps covering of the shame of failure, compensating for what they did by covering something up. And it's in that act of covering that Adam, I think, discovers that the human has the potential to be a creative, interpretive being, and not just to accept the reality that's given to them, not just accept that we're going to walk around naked, but we're going to cover ourselves up and we're going to use whatever we have at our disposal to do so. Immediately following the story of Adam and Chava's failure in Gan Eden, or their inability to listen to what God tells them, they are exiled. And God says to them, in a very ominous description, that life outside, or meaning human life really, is going to be one of great disappointment. You are going to have children and you're going to suffer. You are going to work the land and you're going to suffer. And there's going to be a big gap between what you expect and what actually is given to you in your reality. And all of a sudden, Adam has this epiphany, this moment of realization that if he can be creative in the way in which he physically is able to cover himself and use something creatively as a covering, he can also be a creative being in his perception of the world, in his ability to look at his reality. And instead of listening to the prophecy of gloom that God had just given him, instead he chooses to do something else. He reframes his reality. And instead of calling the woman Isha, he calls her Chava, Kihi Hayita Em Kochai, because she is the mother of all living things. Now, what he does here is the first creative act of reinterpretation of his reality. He says, instead of God saying it's going to be bad, he's saying, no, it's going to be good because we're bringing life to the world. This isn't about our death, because all of a sudden they've been told they're mortal. Says Adam, I am going to interpret it as life. You haven't just given us death, you've given us life. And this is an incredible moment, a moment that God recognizes the power, or I should say that humans recognize the power that God has given them of interpreting their reality. And what does God do? He gives him a ketonet or a garment of skin, or in some traditions it's read as ol with an aleph, as light. By dignifying his own reality, Adam has shown God the power of human creative apperception, and God then dignifies Adam and Chava. This idea of the ketonet is something that is returned to throughout Sefer Bereshit. If we remember, Yosef is given a ketonet kasim, a garment of stripes that his father gives him. But at the beginning, Yosef identifies himself with his external garment, this garment that kind of symbolizes to him the idea of him being chosen by his father, of being a privileged one. And he uses it and he has these dreams where, his brothers are bowing down to him. And instead of kind of recognizing the anger or the jealousy or the pain that he's causing his brother, he continues to tell them the dreams and more about the dreams. There's a very deep sense of recognizing that Yosef does not have any awareness, no emotional intelligence. And very, very soon the garment is ripped out away from him. And with that, all those illusions of grandeur go. And he has to make a journey to himself, and he transforms and he becomes other than he is, until when we see him, he comes to Pharaoh and he tells interprets Pharaoh's dreams. But already by that point, we see that Yosef intuits God in his world. He intuits the pain of others. The butler and the baker come and he sees into their face and he sees V'yereh, he sees them. Yosef is a different person. And therefore, when Paro clothes him with all these beautiful finery and ornamental clothing, it doesn't do anything for him because he knows who he is. He has a strong backbone. He understands that the clothing doesn't make the man. And therefore, when his brothers come, he uses his clothing for the good. He uses his clothing to transform the fate of Egypt, the fate of his people, and to reinvigorate the unity of the brothers. Yehuda and Tamar, we have a very similar story also about clothing. And in this week's Parsha, a large proportion of time is spent on the priestly garments. And the question is why? We're told that the priests, that the Kohanim, the Kohen Gadol especially, but the Kohanim have to wear these clothes lechavod v'letiferet, for honor and splendor of God, of themselves. And once again, we come back to this idea, this motif, this imagery of clothing as transformation. In many other religions, aesthetics, the physical world, placed in the realm of the mundane. There's something in some senses to be denigrated, to rejected, in favor of spirituality or sacredness. They are seen as perhaps inherently wrong or bad. And transformation isn't possible. In Christian theology in particular, the fall of man means the man is inherently bad, inherently sinful, and needs to be redeemed by God, by Jesus, by the priest. He can't redeem himself. Ultimately, the redemption of the world will come through the second coming, and that is God again. In Judaism, there is this no notion of the fall of man. Yes, there is the idea that man has a Yetzer Hara and a Yetzer Hatov, that man has an inclination to bad and good, but man is free. Man has choice. Man can transform his reality by the choices that he makes. He can sanctify the physical realm. And perhaps one of the purposes of Judaism is the transformation of the mundane into the holy. If we think about many different things in the Jewish tradition, they are physical things that are transformed in a spiritual way. Kiddush, food, sex, the world in which we live, they all fall within this mundane physical realm. And yet Judaism asks us to elevate them by sanctifying them, by imbuing them with intimations of divinity. The priests have to wear these clothes. They are extremely aesthetic. We're told in great detail about the finery and the embroidery and the types of ornaments that are put upon them. And in some senses, we could, in some ways, get drawn into this and get pulled into this and kind of maybe even see it as this external beauty, vanity. But instead, the Torah emphasizes that they are used as honor and to dignify the wearer and to dignify and honor God. In Judaism, clothing is very important theme. Why? Because we give space to aesthetic beauty, because we appreciate the physical arena. That's what makes us into human beings, that the creative gesture of a human being is always wrapped up with the physical world around us. Even if we think about art generally, art is always about the perception of the physical world, the way in which we interpret, the way in which we perceive it. And we are told to be creative, perceptive, and artistic people. B'Tzalel, the person who builds the Bet HaMikdash, okay, he is the greatest artist in the Torah, and his name is B'Tzalel. He is in the shadow of God. It's because of our divine spark within us that we have the ability to be creators, to be artists. We are also told it also possesses an ethical mandate. Many times when we are told to clothe the poor person, to buy beautiful finery for our wife and our children for Chagim, in the laws of Chagim, clothing in all of these instances is never an end in itself. It's always a means of sanctification or dignifying or an ethical mandate. And therefore, clothing is a motif in the Torah that symbolizes man's the ability, the potential for our transformation and for our the creative act that we can do. So we're not eternally damned. We are partners with God in the greatest act of creation. And the greatest act creative act that we can do is to transform the physical world into a world of sanctity and good. It's to look at our reality and know how to see it other than it is and to bring it to that point. This Parsha always falls before Purim, and that is the Chag we know of dressing up, of covering up. If we think about Achashverosh's feast, again, a hedonistic, indulgent, decadent affair, total manifestation of physical pleasure. And we're told, according to the Midrash, that the kelim, that the vessels that he used were the vessels from the Beit HaMikdash. How could those vessels filled with sanctity and spirituality be used in such a drastically different way? Because that is the potential that exists on this earth, to use things for the good or for the bad, for sanctity or for its opposite. Esther also is covered up. She goes, she pretends her identity is covered. No one knows who she is. She's in the king's palace. And then the moment of transformation comes. And Mordechai says to her, who knows if for this reason you came here? Meaning, you are in a position, you have covered up. Now use that covering for the good. And she does. She understands that is her destiny. When Haman is closed by Achashverosh, it goes to his head, maybe perhaps even reflective perhaps of the Yosef story at the beginning. He uses it for illusions of grandeur, which lead him ultimately to be able to put the decree against the people, to set the decree against the people of Israel. Mordechai, when he is clothed by Achashverosh, it does nothing, because he has, like we said at the end of the Yosef story, he has a strong core understanding of who he is, and he remains who he is from the beginning of the story to the end. The clothing does not make the man makes the clothing. And so the greatest question that God asks us as humanity is immediately after Adam and Chava have clothed them, have covered themselves up, they have used this creative act for a bad thing because they don't understand that they need to look down deep. And God says, Ayeka, where are you? Under all of those covers and layers that we put upon ourselves, the clothing, the physicality of our world, what exists deep down? Where are you? Are you going to take responsibility for this world? Are you going to be able to see God has given you this divine creative potential? Are you going to use that for the good or for the bad, for hiding and shaming, for acting in dignity and responsibility? Are you going to be able to transform this mundane world that we live in into a place of sacredness and good, rather than a place of falsity and bad? And it shouldn't come as any surprise then that the first act that the Kohen is told to do in this week's Parsha is to light the Ner Tamid, the eternal light. To me, that is the quintessential Jewish act of covenant, of Brit, where the Kohen has to come and he has to make the first move. He has to light the candle. He has to do the physical light of the physical act of bringing light into, kindling light in this world. And then God responds by allowing that light to continue. That is what we are called upon to do. When the priests enter Kodshei HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, they do so wearing the first symbol of human creativity and power, clothing, but they do it by acting lechavod v'letiferet, with dignity and splendor. Because when we learn how to transform the physical objects of our world into things of sacredness, when we learn how to transform the mundane reality that we see that could be just taken for granted into a place, into an arena of God's intimations and divinity, we will be fulfilling exactly what God wants us to do in this world, to tap in to the divine spark, the divine creativity that we all have, and to use it for the good, and to use it to sanctify and redeem a very, very broken world.